Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Alejandro, the CGI Nerd. In this video, we're going to be going over this dissolve effect, or disintegration effect, however you want to call it. It is an effect that I created here in Houdini, and we're going to go through the whole process of doing that with the particles and dynamics and everything like that. So, let's get started! Okay, so to start this off, I'm going to create a geometry node. And inside of the geometry node, I'm going to create a sphere. This is going to be our main geometry, but if you had a model or something else, you can bring that in and use that as our object that's going to be dissolved. And then let's create a box. The box is going to be what I use, oops, to actually dissolve the scene. Let's make this a little bit bigger so that way it encompasses the whole um, sphere. And do it at like 2.2. Here we go. So now what I want to do is create a Boolean. The Boolean is what we're going to use to remove the actual geometry. So on the left hand side, by default, we're going to put the hero object, and on the right hand side, we're going to put the object that's going to create the Boolean. By default, we should see that it pops up the way we want it. Things that we want to also make sure that we are in polygon mode. So let's do polygon mesh, and then let's do this like so that way we have a bit of a smoother sphere there. And then here I have a box, but we're going to increase the geometry on the box too. Let's look at the wireframe really quick so we can see what we're at right now. I want, because I'm going to do some animation on this cube, and I'm going to deform it, I want quite a bit of geometry. You can increase it more than this, but let's say we are at like 50. Depending on the look that you want to do. Okay, so now when we look at the Boolean, it is showing us that because we are on intersect, so they're both intersecting each other because the cube is right on top of the sphere. And whatever section is being intersected, that's what we're actually seeing. If we switched over to like subtract, it's going to subtract whatever is overlapping on of the sphere onto the box. So there's different types of modes that you can switch over, but the mode that we want to be on right now with the way we've set it up is intersect. And then let's say we hold for a frame. Actually, let's not hold for a frame. Well, we're going to start right at the beginning. And then we're going to go for 2 seconds, so we want to be at frame 48. And so that is the length that we're going to be doing it from. So I'm going to start off with the cube. And let's add a transform node. The transform node is going to let us adjust the position and the rotation and things like that. And while I am at it, let's save this just in case, because it's always good to be saving. And let's go into my desktop, CGI Nerd, and let's do a new folder, dissolve, and here we are going to, let's call this dissolve file. There we go. So we have a save. We have this Boolean working right now on this transform. What I want to do is set a keyframe on the translate Y, and then at 2 seconds, so frame 48, I am going to move it down. So it's going to dissolve vertically this way, and we're going to set a keyframe here. So if I push play, we should see it dissolving down like this. Okay, this is working a little bit slow. Let's just bring the geometry down for now, and then we'll kick it up later. 8, 8. And if we play through this now, we should see it a little bit quicker. We can kick up the res later, so that way it runs a little bit smoother. So that is great. In the Boolean, we have a few options to actually see or create groups. So I'm going to first create a null node. And this is going to be our geo or out geo. So that way I can bring this into another node if I needed to. But then down here I'm going to create a blast node. And the blast node will basically delete something. Right now we don't have any groups, but if we do that, it's just deleting everything, which obviously we do not want to delete everything, but we do want to create a group and then delete the group. So let's say we have a few options for groups here. A inside B. Let's try that one. And then let's go blast. And over here in the group, we can do A inside B. Okay, that's not the group I wanted, so let's do the second one. A outside B. Oh, I want to make sure I'm here. I might have actually had it right the first time, so let's delete this. And, oops. Gotta make sure that I have the right one. Let's check this one really quick. Okay, that's not what I want. So, it might have been the first one. I just had the wrong display node on. So let's do A inside B. And here, A inside B. That's exactly what I want. So it creates this little geometry that goes from top to bottom as it dissolves, which is just that top layer of the faces as it's getting dissolved. I'm going to use that to actually create the particles from. So this is going to be our particle emitter. Geo. And let's create another geometry node. This is going to be our hero object, our hero geo. And in here we can go in and get a object merge. And let's look for the particle emitter geo, and we want the out geo. So let's accept that. So we have that geometry, and we can see that they're merged together in the scene, but we have one that is just the top where we're going to be emitting particles from, and then we're going to have the bottom that is our main hero geo. And later on, as we if we want to, we can actually go in and here and increase the geometry. So let's say we wanted like a 20 by 20 sphere, and it matches it over there. So that is great. Let's do maybe 10 by 10 right now because we're going to add a little bit of noise to it, because right now when we're looking at the dissolve, it kind of goes okay, but it is very soft and even. So let's add a mountain node, and we'll do it after the move so it's not moving all that. Using the mountain node, we can actually see that it dissolves in a so after adding the mountain node, it dissolves in a non-linear way to make it a bit more organic and interesting to look at. So let's go into the object level, and we can play that through. There is an issue at the end where it's not going as far down as we need it to. So let's go to the particle emitter geo and to the transform node, back to frame 48, and let's bring this at negative 2.5 and set a keyframe there. So that should get us the dissolve all the way down. It looks like we got a little bit coming out over there, so let's also make the box a tiny bit bigger. So let's do 2.5, 2.5, and 2.5. And we get it all the way dissolved without having any issues. Let's look at the geometry just so that you can see kind of what's happening. So the geometry here is actually deforming, and as it plays, it has that kind of noise that we're moving it through. And that is what's giving us the effect once we do the Boolean to actually dissolve in a nonlinear fashion. And we can go to the blast node, go back to the object node. So now we want to emit particles so it's not just kind of like a wipe down on the character, so that it looks like it's kind of like coming out in a little bit of particulates. So let's go to particles, and we are going to do the source particle emitter. So the source is going to be our particle emitter geo that we created, and I'm going to click that, and it creates a few things for us. So let's go into the object mode. Let's lay out all of this. So we had the particle emitter and the particle geo, or the hero geo, but now we have an Autodot network and the source particles. So if we were to just play it the way it is right now, this is kind of what is happening, and that's okay. But we can do that better. The Autodot network is where all the physics and everything is calculated. And then here in the source geometry, this is, or so the source particle, this is basically where we are getting the particles, and if we want to adjust anything of how the particles looks, we can do that there. Let's start off with how they move inside of the dynamics. So one thing I do want to do is make sure that we have a ground plane. So I'm going to go to collisions and create a ground plane. And let's see how this plays, but I think it's just going to end there. So the ground plane itself, I do want to bring down, and it looks like it's just like 1 unit in the negative y. And then let's go here, and that looks correct. Yep. Okay, so let's play this now, and we can see that it does that. It kind of like scatters everywhere because there's no friction right now. So let's look at let's lay this out. This is the ground plane, and we can look at its physical attributes. Right now it has a friction of 1. Let's look at the particles themselves. They do not have any friction at all. So if we had it at 1 as well, we should see that it just kind of like dies there. So that's a little bit better. Now everything's working with gravity and it's pulling down, so it looks pretty good. It's kind of going through the object, and I'm not sure if I want the particles necessarily to go down, but we'll play around with it. Maybe I want them to kind of like float upwards. We could technically, if we wanted to, we can do like 1 in +1 instead of -9.8, and we can see that it kind of moves up. So that's kind of cool. Let's look at that effect as well. That is not too bad. So let's look at the particle emitter geo source. Inside of here, we have the source, which is just what the geometry is looking like, where it's emitting from. The birth is one of the first places that we want to look at. Right now we have an impulse count and the constant birth rate, and they're both set to 1, or constant activation, but the impulse count is set to 0 and the birth rate is set to 5,000. We can use this, but they're basically two different methods to generate particles. Max points per frame, this is the limit that we have right now. We can leave it at that. Life expectancy. Life expectancy is in seconds, so right now it is existing from the birth of the particle for 100 seconds, so it's not going to dissolve at all. Let's say we only wanted it to live for 1 second, and let's play this here, and we can see that we get it dissolving a little bit more in an interesting manner. Let's say that we wanted it to live for 2 seconds and see how that works. I kind of like that a little bit better. There is a weirdness that's happening. It's that it's kind of like everything is ending at the same level. If you want to have a little bit more organic kind of range, you can do a life variance. And let's say we did a life variance of 1, so it's going to be a variance of 1 second. So it can live as short as 1 second or as much as 3 seconds. So let's play this. And we can see that like the way it dissipates, it's a little bit more interesting, and we can actually feel that that's a little bit more believable. With the gravity, maybe with the force at 1 is a little bit high. Let's do a 0.5. So it's like half as strong. Let's see what that looks like. And this is going to be way too long right now, so let's do this. Let's end it at 100 frames. Let's make the whole sequence only 100 frames. There's still some particles there. Let's do about 150. Not 250. 150. And 150 here. There we go. Now we get all the particles dissolving, which is what we want. Okay, let's now look at some other stuff that we can do. So when we look at it, it's just kind of like moving upwards. Let's actually look at any of the settings right here. Attributes might be something else that we want to play around with. Inherent velocity, it's at 1, but the variance is kind of interesting because right now with the variance, it's actually adding a little bit of movement. If we had it all set to 0, it's going to kind of all come out even with no acceleration or anything like that. It's just moving negative 0.5 units upwards because of the gravity. So I'm actually going to put this back at 1. I just wanted to show you what it did. But you can, if you wanted it to be more variant or have a potential of going out in other directions a little bit more, you can control it here. Let's look at the pop object here. The pop object, we already looked at the physics, but we have the amount of bounciness, the bounce force, friction, and dynamics and things like that we can control there. Now that we actually have it moving upwards, we don't need the ground plane anymore. So I'm gonna just delete all that. But if you did want it to go down, you do need that ground plane, and I'm gonna delete the ground lane at the object level as well. And I'll go back into the Autodot network. So we have that effect there. Okay, so the pop solver is another place where we can actually adjust this here. The sub-steps in this section here, basically it's how many times it will calculate between frames. Right now it's only doing 1 calculation per frame. So if I wanted it to be a little bit more detailed, if I saw some banding or something like that, I can actually control that here by increasing these numbers. But obviously as I increase these numbers, the as I increase these numbers, the calculation for the simulation is going to take longer to work with the physics. Let's not worry about here. Collisions. For this one, we don't need collisions, but if you needed to, you can turn on the collisions here. Sleeping, binding, distribution. That's kind of all I'm going to mess on with the pop solver is that the substeps here. So let's say we wanted to influence this and kind of have it do more things than what we just have right now. What we can do is look at anything in pops pretty much. The pop section is all to do with particles, and we can adjust how it interacts with different sources or forces, sorry, and things like that. So if I were to pop axis force, that's a force that we can actually use, and I'll put it before the merge. And that's going to give us a little bit of effect. Let's look at there we go, from the top. As it dissolves, you can see that they're spinning now. So if we wanted to, so that you can see what it would look like without that, let's bypass this node here really quick. And you can see that they're all just kind of going out in their merry ways. But as soon as we turn back on the pop axis, you can see as a whole they're kind of like orbiting around each other a little bit more. And that, if we go back to our perspective node, is controlled by this influencer, and it's only going to happen inside of this. And if we have it as soon as the particles get outside of this force, they kind of go with whatever momentum they've already had. So here we can adjust the radius on this if we wanted to affect more of an area or the height. With what I have right now, it is okay. And the direction right now it's moving, the axis is in the Y, and it's going to be spinning around that. So that's why it's +1 on the Y. And we can adjust the position with the center point. There's different types of things. You can do a sphere or a torus shape. I'm going to stick with sphere. And then orbit speed. So if we increase this much higher, and let's go back to the top view and see with a really high value, you can see how much more it's actually spinning. Let's look at it from, oops. 3D view. So that's kind of cool. So I'm going to type in pop here, and we can look at different things that we can actually do. And actually, probably, I increased it really high just so that you can get a clearer idea of what that's doing. But let's bring this down to a lower value. That is pretty cool. And you can play around with the settings. There's fall off, and really that is, there's a little bit of wind resistance and things like that, but really I kind of play around mostly with the speed and the fall off here, and sometimes with the shape if I need to. Okay, so let's try adding another force into here. Let's do a pop, and let's add a little bit of a drag. So that's gonna kind of be like resistance of the air. So that's cool. And if we wanted to, we can actually give it a direction. So let's say we wanted it to move a little bit in, like if it had wind in the x direction. We can see that it is blowing around that way, and let's move it this way so that we're looking at the positive direction that way. And looking at the way the wind is interacting with the scene right now, I think that there's actually some stuff going back under the ground and whatnot. Let's look at the object level of everything here. Yeah, it's definitely kind of moving down a little bit as it goes underneath the ground plane. So I'm actually going to create the ground plane and bring it back in. Let's put this at negative. -1. Oops. It's not -2, -1. So let's look at the playback. Just in case it did decide to go to under the ground, we can actually prevent it from doing that there. I actually don't want this to render. I just want it there to do collisions, so that is good. Let's lay out everything and go back into our Autodot network. So that drag, we can add wind and we can increase it, but you get the idea of what that is doing. Right now it's ignoring mass, but if we wanted to give everything mass and interact with it that way, we could. So let's take a look at rendering these particles. Right now when we render it, it should look something like this. Let's render again just to make sure. And it gives us the look of the object there dissolving in the particles. It just looks like a whole bunch of balls and spheres. So if we go into the source particles, and in here let's go in and add a point VOP, we can actually control a little bit more how the particles look. So the first thing we want to be able to control is the size of these particles because they're all pretty even. Let's do a bind export, and then we'll do a parameter, and we'll connect these two together. The thing that we want to bind is the p scale. So the p scale is the particle scale. By default this goes down to 0, that's why they all disappear. So let's go in here and then we can put it at like 0.01 or something like that, so that way we have particles there. If we did 0.1, you can kind of see what the scale is. 0.05 and so forth. So I think I'm going to start off with that. So that gives us a kind of idea of what the particles are going to look like in the scale. Right now it's kind of boring and bland. The particle doesn't look as believable because they're constantly the same size. So let's go in and add a divide node. And we have two attributes that we can actually start dividing here. We have the age and the life. The age is how old the particle is in frames currently, and then the life is how long will that particle live for. So let's connect the age as one of the values, and then the life as the second value that we're going to divide together. Then we are going to clamp them together. And what the clamp does is it takes those values and connects it from 0 to 1. We still haven't connected it here. Let's say we did connect it here. We can kind of see what it looks like. You can see that it kind of goes small and then it gets bigger. If we wanted to combine it with this parameter that we have here, let's do a multiply node. And then we can connect that multiply node there. And then the parameter that we have, we can connect it as a second value. So we can see that it is getting smaller as it gets older, but it uses this value here as a way to control the size. So we can actually go in here and say, well, maybe that's too small. We want it at 0.05 instead. And that looks a little bit better for us. We like that. One of the things that is kind of an issue for us now with the way it is that it's going backwards. I actually want them bigger when it's coming here, and then as they get older, I want them to start disappearing. So we have a node for that as well. There is a complement node, and if we connect it here, it'll actually do the reverse. So right now the particles are too big. So let's go back out here and let's put it at the value that we had it at before. Okay, so we have that kind of done there. We can also, and you can see as they kind of get smaller as they go away, we could also go in and maybe give it a little bit more randomness overall. So let's do a random node. And this random node, we're going to connect it to the ID number for each particle, because each particle has its own individual ID. And then that is going to be generating a random number. So let's connect it into another point here. So we can see that it gives us a little bit more natural looking particles because they are more randomized now. Let's put this kind of like in between just so that way we don't have any of the lines crossing over each other. There we go. So let's look at adjusting the color of these particles. We can do a ramp. Parameter. So this ramp parameter, we're going to connect it to the CD. And right now we have two colors, and if we actually go out to the source, we'll see that we can actually manipulate it here and choose a color if we wanted to. So if we wanted it to be red, or if we wanted it to be blue, we can do that, and then it dissolves down to, let's say, this kind of blue. And right now it has these colors, and maybe this is kind of, oops, let's take that out. I just want to maybe adjust this so it's more white. And you can see that it's not really reading the transition from one color to the next. The reason is because it doesn't know how to do it. It just knows that we have this range of colors and it doesn't know how to assign it. So what we can do is base it off of the age. So we already have this that is giving us an age for each particle. Let's just connect it there into the particles. And let's go back at the source level and see if we can get a more kind of intense color so that we can see the change. So go to red. So you can see that it transitions out into that red color. And if we adjust the slider, you can see that we can give it more. Let's close this just so you can see more of the particles red versus blue, depending on how we want it to work. Alright, so let me go back to this kind of color here that I had before, and I'll make it more kind of like white. Well, I went completely to white. I don't want completely white, I just want some color there. And then maybe this color here. I am going to go to this color, but I want to push it more to that kind of bright saturated color. So I'm going to be dissolving between these two colors here. And then looking at this now, I can make them bigger, but I don't really want to make the particles bigger. I want to maybe add more particles. So let's go to the object level. Now that we have a look for the particles, I can go here into the Autodot network. And we can go into the particle emitter here and look at the birth. Right now we're creating 5,000 particles here per second, so let's increase this. Say that we're gonna do like, oops, I don't want Siri, go away. Right now it's 5,000. Let's say what happens if we went to 50,000. And right now this goes orange, so this isn't actually what it looks like. Let's go back to frame 1. And then we'll check over here at frame 2, and then let's go to the render view so that we can actually get a clear idea of what this render is actually looking like. So that is better, but maybe 500,000. I want more and more particles. I just don't want to see too much of the edge there. That's good there. But actually, we need to go back to frame 1 and then go to frame 2 or 24 so that way it calculates it out. So maybe that's a bit too much. Instead of 500,000, let's just do 100,000. And again, we have to go back to frame 1 and then jump to whatever frame we want. And then let's go to the scene view just so that we can see the whole animation to see if it's still something that we kind of like. So now that it's cached out, we can kind of see it a little bit better there. It goes, okay, and then let's look at the render, probably at like somewhere around there. And then let's look at the render again here and render this frame. And I'm going to go back into the source particles. And here, maybe with this parameter. Oops. Say 0.1. So the 0.1's way too big, but I want it a little bit bigger. 0.025. That's a little bit better. I kind of like that. Okay, yeah, it's not going to play back at that render time like that, but here we can play it, and it kind of gives us an idea of what's going to be going on. Let's look at applying a shader to this. So, to add a shader, we're going to go to the material palette, and we can drop in a shader. If we use something like the principled shader, it's going to be accepting lighting information rather than doing something like a constant. I'm going to take this shader and apply it here, and then on the base color I'm going to push it all the way to white, so that way we get the colors that we're working with. So let's look at the render view here and see what that's looking like now. Okay, we don't have any lighting yet, so let's go into the scene view and start, oops, I don't need that. Start setting up a little bit of lighting information. So I want to go into light setups, and I'm just going to do something simple. I'm going to create a environment light. And let's go to the object level. We have the light here in the scene. Transforms. Let's move it up. Really doesn't matter. Oops. It's going here, and the light, actually let's look at the render now that we have the light in the scene, and render this. So you can see that they're self-shadowing now because it's actually taking the lighting information from the lights and affecting that there. If we wanted to, we can actually go in. Oh no! Okay, let me get it back to where it was. Remember to save often. Okay, I got the scene back to the way it was. I just kind of changed the colors a little bit. Let's go back to the scene view so you can see it there. Basically, I just kind of used it with the orange color that is kind of my branding on my channel anyway, so that makes sense to do it with those colors, but for CGI Nerd. But that is how I have that looking now. And let's go a little bit further, somewhere around there. And if you want to see the actual sliders, because I did do a little bit more finessing on the color. Basically, I have a few different colors so that it's kind of like sharper here. Then it goes to white, complete white, and then it slowly transitions to kind of like a yellow-orange. And in the last little moments of its life, it goes back to like a full-blown orange. So we have that effect, and then as it goes at the end, it kind of has that little variance, and it brings kind of a lot more interest into the look. But let's go back here. We have the light in the scene now, and we'll probably want somewhere around frame 30. Let's look at 24. Okay, so that is working well with the way I want it to be. And then I am going to create another shader. And this shader, I'm actually going to make it that orange color, so that way it is basically the sphere. So that way we have that kind of orange color there. You can drag and drop it onto the scene like that. That is great. Okay, so let's go back to the scene view. Let's create a grid in the scene. We'll bring it down. And let's scale it up like by 10 units. And let's look at what the render looks like now. So we have some shadows and things like that. That's looking good. I'm going to create another shader just so that I have something there. And then I'm going to assign that to the ground, and maybe that shader, I'm going to make it white. So that way I have the ground and the material there. I can tweak it a little bit more if I wanted to later on. So that way it's looking the way I want it to. Oops, not composite view, but render view. That's what I got. Let's go to the object mode and let's create, or not create, but go to the light. And I got the render settings here. And let's see, shading, geometry. I think that there is a way. Okay, I have the grid selected. I want the light selected. There we go. Light. And then render light geometry. So if we do that, we kind of have it completely filled in, so that way it looks a little bit more interesting. Um, if we're going to do a full-on render, let's stop this really quick here. Let's go to our scene view. We're going to need to create a camera. So right here where it says no camera, let's create a new camera. And there we go. We have that set up. Inside of the let's see, render view. This is where we can adjust the resolution and whatnot. So let's say we wanted 1080p because I'm recording everything else at 1080p. That makes sense. Focal length, let's say I like to go wide. So let's do a 28mm lens. And then I'm going to lock the camera onto this viewport so that way I can move it here. And I just want a little bit of that wide angle view. Maybe I can kind of get it up like that. But let's look at the render, or let's play it through actually. It's just kind of how that is working. I don't have, I do have a ground plane. Okay, cool. It's just that this plane that we have is maybe not low enough, so let's do -1. There we go. I was just noticing that it was kind of cropping off the bottom of the sphere. That's looking good. Okay, so now that we have that done, let's look at setting up the render. So if we want to go to the render, let's go to the out panel. We have a mantra node here. We want to render the frame range. It's going to go up to 150, which is what we have right now. Let's go to the rendering tab here. Ray tracing is fine. If we want to enable depth of field, we can. It'll probably look better, but I don't want it to take too long rendering right now, so I am going to allow motion blur because I want a bit of a trail. I'm going to adjust the shutter offset to -1. It's going to give us a little bit of a kind of trail, and it looks better because it's calculating backwards rather than forward, so that way it is, like especially with the starting frames, it'll just look a little bit better. And with those settings, let's look at here and take a render from the render view, see what it's looking like now. These renders will take longer overall to get the look that you want. So once it starts rendering, here if you want to look at somewhere kind of specifically, you can click with your cursor and kind of get the render happening exactly where you want, and you can see that's like only 2%. But what I'm really interested in is in the end and seeing if we get that motion blur, which we are not. So let's go into the object mode right now and let's look at the camera really quick. Is it the camera that we want to do this in? This will control the motion blur as well. Maybe it's in the particle source here. Sampling. Yeah, geometry velocity blur here inside of the particle source. I want to switch the sampling. Right now it says no velocity blur. I want to turn on the velocity blur there. So that should give us now that motion blur that we were looking for. And that will make it look overall much, much better. So I'm going to pause the video right here so that way we can see how this looks like with a single frame, a little bit cleaner. Maybe this is a little bit dark. I'm going to also, like while it's played out, while the video's not playing, I'm going to actually maybe play around a little bit more with the lighting and add some more interest, and then I'll show you guys exactly what I did while I am doing that part afterwards. Okay, so I got this all set up for us, and this is what the render looked like. I ended up switching it to 800 by 800. I figured I'd use it for Instagram. The full 1080p render was taking like over 10 minutes, and I didn't want to wait that long for render. So with the 800 by 800, it's more manageable to render the 150 frames. And let's look at rendering the sequence now here inside of Houdini. So we're going to want to switch over to the out, and we have the settings here. We don't want to override camera resolution because we've already set it there. I think we got all the settings we want. So you can render to disk if you want to save to a specific area. I'm just going to render to mplay. And that's going to open up a window here. There you go. And it shows us what frame we are on. And then we have a sequence here where we can actually look at the whole render as it goes through and renders. So obviously the frames with no particles are going to render fast compared to the frames when it starts getting particles and a lot more particles and whatnot. And as it goes through, we can even play this and watch the sequence go. And what I'm going to do now is pause this again, and I will play this through once the render is done for you guys. Okay, so this is what the dissolve effect or the disintegration effect or whatever you want to call it is looking like here at the render after we rendered everything. If we wanted to save this, we can just go to the image viewer file, save sequence as, and then we can change the settings here and export whatever format we would like to export as. and then choose a destination and save it. I'm just going to leave it like that and click save. Overwrite because I already saved it. Great. So it is all saved now. And that is it for this project. I hope you guys found this useful, and we'll see you guys in the next video.